Jeffrey, it is a pleasure to see you again. We've done quite a few conversations over the years, but not one for quite a while.
Did you and I used to be optimists? I can't.
Oh, you're cutting to the chase.
Well, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I think we were optimists.
I think I was, and you've kind of preempted. Before speaking to you today, I was thinking, God, there are so many ways into the huge issues that we're facing. Not just this acceptance of tyranny, but this clamor for it. Where should I begin? And I think you've just chosen the starting place.
Well, Robin, we have to think back, because we've been together for hours and hours and hours, many occasions, discussing many deep and very serious philosophical issues concerning liberalism and liberty, and what kind of world we should be going for, whether and to what extent we should be rallying around constitutionalism or anarchism, or what is the relationship between liberty and order? And we've had all these discussions, right? We both have, and they've been compelling and fascinating. We've had our agreements and disagreements, although I was always respectful. But I'm guessing that I'm speaking also for you, in the sense that, I think we were not aware of the extent to which the very foundations of everything that you and I believe in, which is like basically, for lack of a better term, something like mere liberalism, had completely collapsed underneath us, and just how threatened it really was, and how vulnerable it was to being completely shattered under the right conditions. And who would have imagined that the right conditions would be a pathogen?
A pathogen with a very limited ability actually to do harm. If we're just, thinking percentages.
Sure.
It didn't take much, did it? It really didn't take a lot to put an entire nation in abject fear, to the point of asking to have their liberties taken away.
Yeah, disease panic, right? I might get unclean. I might get exposed to somebody or something that will threaten me mortally, that that could injure my cleanliness, that could make me dirty. So where's my authority to tell me how to manage this? And I'll comply completely with whatever they say. And governments were more than happy to oblige, with insane dictates, masks and plexiglass and social distancing, and the travel restrictions, the vaccine mandates and passports, and so on. So it doesn't matter. I think at this point, public authority could force us all to wear propellers on our heads, and people would go along with it. It's just unbelievable.
Is there? You asked at the beginning, did we used to be optimists? I think we did. The implication is that we are no longer. So let's make the question explicit.
Yeah.
Is there any point anymore? Is there any hope anymore?
So, Robin, I think you and I need to think about this very seriously, because I think there is a crisis coming, like a crisis of authority and a loss of confidence in public authority. It's what's so on one hand, you've got this compliance motivation on the part of, let's just say it's half. On the other hand, and let's just say it's the other half, you've got people that are incredulous and have lost confidence in public authority and law. Now, the anarchist part of me might say, oh, this is exciting. This is good. It's about time people, look at the state and say, see, they're liars. See, they don't know what they're talking about. See, they're incompetent. But Robin, I am not so Panglossian about this topic. I'm a little more with Lord Sumption on this. Like, when people lose confidence in their institutions, public messaging from public officials and public sources, and their institutions don't function anymore, the courts, public health, I'm not sure that leads to good outcomes necessarily. I think it might lead to very bad outcomes, actually.
So now this causes me to recall, I think, Jeffrey, one of our most recent, although quite a long time ago, conversations, where you were indicating to me that you were becoming more concerned, I guess, about the practicalities, if I can put it that way, of a massive move towards liberty or anarchy, because those who seek anarchy have little to say about, you know, how we manage the landing on the other side. Is that what you're talking about here?
I think that's right. I think that's right. So I think, and this has animated our discussions for a very long time, and you taught me something very important in the course of our engagements, which is the liberal foundations of what we used to call libertarianism, you know, or capitalist, anarcho-capitalist ideology, whatever you want to call it. It has deep roots in the construction of certain values that we've all taken for granted, not so much in law, but in culture. And as a society, we believe that we've had something of a philosophy, a public philosophy about things like equal dignity and equal rights and free association and free speech and these basic principles, freedom of religion, you know. I mean, we always thought that, you know, like you taught me how important a fabric that is for having a foundation for the more refined aspects of our ideological reflections concerning libertarianism, anarchism, or whatever it's going to be. But there's a culture, there's a deeper constitution, or I hope you don't mind my using this term, a social contract, you know, endemic, evolutionary. I have no problem. I mean, there's an agreement we've made with each other to respect rights and to have equality and this kind of stuff. And that's where I think libertarianism has failed to organically relate itself to its past, right? So it's become too axiomatic, right? I think you and I have agreed on this many times. It's like something happened in the last 40 years where libertarianism became axiomatic and a little bit, you know, like overly strict and a little too simple, overly simplified.
One might even say ideologically top down.
Yeah, right. And so we failed to understand that there's certain things we can't understand, you know, and among those things are the evolved multi-generational quality of this social contract, or this shared understanding of what kind of life we want to live. And I think libertarianism lost touch with that sometime over the last, I don't know. I don't want to put data, but let's just say 40 or 50 years, something like that, you know? Yeah. And sure enough, you and I have watched, either we have not been in touch. We watched in shock and amazement to see, you know, the sector of the ideological world that you and I sort of inhabit and have variously appreciated, even loved, prove itself to be completely inept, to the point of near silence in the face of the greatest crisis of statism in our lives. And that is extremely revealing.
Yeah, my goodness, you really did just say it. I don't know quite what it is, but you just said it. And I as you mentioned some of the aspects of the cultural fabric that are so important, I am caused to think of, if you like, the material, I'm pushing the metaphor now, the material of which that fabric consists, the threads, which I think is trust. We had, as a culture, a lot of trust in the West. It's a high trust culture, especially the United States. The reason why, you know, my tenant doesn't screw me as a landlord in America, it's not actually because he or she signed the lease. It's because in our culture, when you sign something, when you say something, when you intend something, you generally mean it. You generally mean it. And that is not true all around the world. And I am thinking that, I know it's always cheap to go to Hitler, but I just have to do it now. When in the 30s in Germany, Hitler didn't get everyone to agree with exterminating the Jews by simply banging on about how nasty and bad the Jews were. In fact, he didn't really do that at all. What he did was to get Germans to start distrusting other Germans, to see other Germans as actually health risks. He used the language of immunology, of virology, of safety a lot in explaining to Germans why the Jews among them are a threat at a personal level. Don't go near them. I'm not saying the intent is the same, but it seems to me that what we're going through, maybe inadvertently, involves much of the same method, and is going to have potentially a large part of the same outcome.
The point is an important one. It's that your neighbor is a biological threat to you.
Yes.
Maybe not a moral threat, maybe not even a behavioral threat.
Although I think all of those things too now, right? I mean, I experienced that in conversations about COVID and so on.
Sure, but ultimately, what really gets people going is the idea of a biological threat.
Yes.
Which is to say a health threat, which is to say public health. And you mentioned Hitler, and certainly that's true. You can go back in American history very recently, I mean, like if you read the 1880s writings of the early racialist philosophers of the early progressive era, you will see that the basis of segregation in the United States was today we talk about it as racial, and it is racial, but it was basically a biological threat. They went to great lengths to demonstrate the threat that people who are not like you represent to your gene pool, to your children, and yes,
to
your own safety. And so I'll just mention this 1886 book called Race Traits of the American Negro, the published by the American Economic Association. It's a very large book. You can look it up on archive.org, and if you have the stomach for it, you can read it. But it's like 400 pages, chapter by chapter by chapter, demonstrating the health risks of non-ruling class people. So blacks, Jews, poor whites, they all represent a kind of a profound threat. So segregate them, keep them away, don't let them propagate themselves. We have to have racial, we have to have biological passports basically for people if we're going to survive as a society. So this impulse has animated the 20th century. It's this kind of hygienic fascism, And, isn't it interesting, Robin, that I think we always knew this intellectually. I feel like I knew it intellectually, but I didn't really believe it would become a living reality in our times. I just didn't think we would come to the point that this whole apparatus would be revived, so presciently in our own times in a way that would be a fundamental threat to our liberties. But it has.
The structure of the argument that's being made against unvaccinated people, it seems to me is the same as that was made, and indeed in some places still is made, against certain groups, perhaps based on ethnicity or skin color.
Or class. Or class.
Indeed. We exactly. We no longer accept, for example, saying we should limit the rights of Black men because they are more likely to commit crimes. What we say is we can only limit the rights of a particular Black man, or indeed any human being, when we have evidence that they have actually committed a crime. However, when it comes to vaccines, we are saying, apparently, that we can limit the rights of unvaccinated people because as a group, averaged out, they pose some greater risk, actually in quite an abstract way, to me or to the rest of society, even though we could test each individual unvaccinated person, discover that they're not carrying a disease, and therefore pose exactly the same risk as a vaccinated person that does not carry a disease, namely 0, right? So when it comes to this, it's perfectly fine to limit the rights of individuals based on averages across groups. That's the civil rights movement was about not doing that anymore.
Right.
The left has been, totemically making their motivating desire to put that away once and for all. Certainly, it seems to me in the last decade or so. But now it's back with a vengeance. I mean, and it's so obviously back with a vengeance. We are actually talking about people who are unvaccinated being dangerous per se, whereas my vaccine status poses no threat whatsoever to anyone. It's whether I am diseased, at the very least, that in principle could pose a threat. But we've completely forgotten that. It's like saying being a young Black man is a threat. It's the equivalent.
Yeah, no, it is the equivalent. I mean, you only have to tweak the details just slightly, and you end up with the exact same results as what we were talking about in the 1880s and 1890s led to Jim Crow laws. I mean, and segregation, yes, and everything else, and immigration controls and so on.
Well, and actually, just as you mentioned, sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey, but go with that, because I live in Seattle, and as of October the 25th, I won't be able to go into a restaurant or a bar or whatever, privately owned in my city, without my papers. And I will be treated based on my vaccine status differently from someone who has a different vaccine status.
Right.
Now,
well,
what's that if not modern Jim Crow?
Of course it is. Yeah, of course it is. We should have seen this coming, because you remember in the spring of 2020, both de Blasio in New York and Governor Cuomo, do you remember who they blamed for for super spreader events and spreading of COVID?
I mean, I don't know, but I'll take a guess that it was Trump.
But Trump was the lockdown back in those days, but no, it was the Orthodox Jews.
Oh, tell me more.
So there's very large communities of Hasidic Jews in New York, and they are, in modern parlance, anti-vax, which is to say they rely fundamentally on strategies of herd immunity and scaling of the immune system to protect themselves, not just from COVID, but from everything. This is the world of measles parties and chickenpox parties and that sort of thing, right? So yeah. And you could say they're protected from smallpox thanks to herd immunity, which, okay, fine, great. So no, they, of course, universally, as a matter of religious precept and social custom, completely rejected every aspect of, well, there weren't vaccines in those days. We're talking about April, May of 2020. But there were social distancing measures in place, and mask mandates, and also shutdown of churches and religious, and restrictions against super spreading events, and you could only have 10 people in your home, and so on. You couldn't travel. Well, the Hasidic Jews just completely rejected this and continued to hold their mass weddings, mass funerals, and mass gatherings. They went on with their lives, same as everybody else. And Yeah, so both de Blasio and Cuomo went after the Jews and said, you're spreading COVID. And I thought, this is interesting. So we definitely have an ethos in this country that condemns anti-Semitism. We definitely do. And God knows everybody's educated in school about, relationship between hatred of the Jews and the Holocaust and so on and so on. And yet, like in an instant, boom, you had the two of the most powerful politicians in America suddenly demonizing an entire group, saying you're spreading disease, poisoning the well, as they said in the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah.
And there wasn't a word of protest about it. And I thought, wow, they're going after the Jews. What's next? Well, we found out what's next, right? So in New York City, only about 20% of African Americans are fully vaccinated, if that, And the mayor just very freely imposes an order, says you cannot participate in public life in New York unless you've complied with the following health dictates. An identical thing was done in the 1890s, and I just looked at a New York Times article where they had roundups of African Americans who forced them to get the smallpox vaccine that they did not want, and people were demonizing them and that sort of thing. So it's just this exact same thing's going on. I mean, you can change the deal. So here's the problem, Robin. I think is one of the problems with the read of history that we tend to do. We always read history in a Whiggish way. We're like, what did these bad people back then do to each other? My God, those people were brutal. They were rough on each other. We replicate the exact same thing in our own time, and we're blind to it. We pretend like it's not happening. Why? I mean, because doctrinally, we're somehow better than they were. So we can't possibly reproduce those errors. It's not possible for us to replicate these things.
Do you see any justification in the kind of lockdowns and treatment of groups that we're talking about in the need of, let's say, public agencies and officials to simply prevent, as a practical matter, the complete overwhelming of our healthcare systems? Is that a kind of a physical limit that when we hit, these things become justifiable?
Well, I guess the answer to that is maybe, depending on circumstances of time and place, right? But the problem is you give the power to elected officials and public health authorities to decide when and to what extent that's true. And they're almost always going to abuse it. To me, the availability of hospital resources is an economic problem, rationing, right? And which, I guess you're an American now, but you've been watching the UK situation very carefully. So you've got this National Health Service there. It's always about rationing healthcare. They don't want to ration by price, so they ration by some other means, right? So it became a big issue there. Much less of an issue in the US. I'm not focused on the hospitalization issue that carefully, but I have looked at regional situations and seeing that hospital resource use has been mostly flat for 5 years with no actual increase during the pandemic. You could say that's because we rationed resource, but we saw a 60 to 80% decline in colonoscopies or scanning for colon cancer, which is the third leading cause of death. I mean, people just stopped showing up to the doctor.
Well, that says something about the problem, maybe the ineffectiveness of the ways in which we have been rationing, or that rationing has happened. But it does speak to the fact that we have hit resource limits with healthcare. And it does seem so, Pacific Northwest, Idaho, and Montana, near where I am, that is happening.
Sure.
Getting my annual preventative health check a couple of years ago, I experienced resource limitation here in Seattle as much as I ever did with the NHS in the UK.
Sure.
And when I was trying to find out why I couldn't simply make a 15-minute appointment to get this thing done, except by waiting 6 or 8 weeks, I was told it was because of the massive population influx into Seattle, which I'm sure is true. I believe that.
There's always a reason.
Yeah. So, the fact is there are limited resources here. That I think reasonable people could say, well, look, we can't have the thing falling over. The elected officials, that is their job to make sure it doesn't. So when we get to that point and that point only, then they can make these sweeping.
Okay, but Robin,
go ahead.
There's a number of problems. I mean, for one thing, like if in Austin, Texas, suddenly everybody wanted to drink beer, not wine, I'm pretty sure the restaurants would scale. Right? Everybody
takes time, right? The difference is it takes time, and the claim is that people are dying in that transition period. So it's not the same as wine and beer. That's the argument.
So, okay, or maybe it's donuts, and we have to, or maybe it's toilet paper, because we actually had this problem, right? So suddenly nobody was going to the office. So industrial toilet paper, the demand for industrial toilet paper went down. So everybody wanted Charmin, at home. Well, there wasn't enough. So we didn't actually have a shortage. What we had was a supply chain shift, right? One thing led to another. So the markets do this better. I'm just not. So here's the problem, Rob. I'm just not sure that public health authority have any contribution to make, even in the presence of a real issue. Here's another issue that's fascinating to me. I mean, we cannot find, no matter how hard we look, any evidence that there's some relationship between stringencies, social distancing measures, limitations of crowds, and the mitigation of the spread of the viruses. Like maybe there is some relationship there, but anyway, science has yet to been able to demonstrate that. You just can't find it. And we have experiments all over the world now, and I've looked through, I think, hundreds of studies, and you just can't seem to find any relationship between these two things. Like, we don't know whether and to what extent any of these public health measures have been responsible for any change in the virus trajectory. We just don't know.
Yes.
And that's weird, because we continue to use them no matter what.
Which is obviously, well, I don't put words in your mouth, but it because what you have just said is currently the case, that seems to be evidence for the political and performative nature of the policy at this point, even if it wasn't at the beginning.
Yeah, I think so. But the absence of evidence is overwhelming. Like, here's one of the reasons I'm exhausted. Over a year and a half, I've done nothing but debunk nonsense that you read on the internet, and so you look at the data, you try to prove it. I've written, I don't know, hundreds of articles, right, on these topics, and then as soon as you debunk one claim, then there's another claim, and you debunk that claim, there's another claim. The lies get millions of views, and the falsehoods get thousands of views. I mean, and the debunking of the lies get thousands of views. So it's like we can't really shoot these things down. I think it's going to be years. It's going to be a decade before we're even prepared to come to terms with the failures of what we've experienced,
And do you think that as we do so, we will realize that we made a mistake, or that we've turned the ratchet so many moves in one direction that we are just, simply in more tyranny now and forever?
So I don't believe that we can know what forever looks like. But the now is going to last a lot longer than I ever wanted it to. I assumed that the world would shake itself off this disease panic sometime in late March of 2020. It didn't happen. It just got worse, and it's getting worse all the time. And, the vaccine passport is the latest thing. The vaccine is the latest thing. And then the vaccine passport is the latest thing. So it's just all kind of like cover-ups, So I don't know when we can come to terms with it. It's a little bit like prohibition. They imposed prohibition in the United States in 2019 and said, we're going to have a society without any production and consumption of alcohol, and that's going to fix poverty and pauperism and single motherhood and illiteracy and everything else. And of course, it created a disaster. And we repealed that by 1933. But there really never was a coming to terms with who made that mistake, who imposed that policy on us. Can we have a little honesty and truth about this? Like that moment never came. It never came. We just easily glided from authoritarianism to quasi-liberalism, as if that was just, man, that's just what you do. And we just didn't have any coming to terms with what happened. So I'm afraid that's what's going to happen to us with COVID. And the narrative is being laid out right now. And it should be very disturbing to you to see the kind of language that's emerged over the last 48 hours. Now, any attempt to have liberalism, to have a liberal policy concerning this virus and a threat to the population is decried as right-wing.
Yeah, that seems to be par for the course. I was very interested and fervent about the Brexit debate in my native land, and it seemed to me that those who were arguing against, the European superstate and all its pretensions were, in as much as they were doing so, liberal with a small L, but they were always painted as on the far right of the Conservative Party.
That's what they always said.
Similarly, Ron Paul, when I got in properly involved in American politics, when Ron Paul was running in 2011, 2012, they always called him back then, they call him a libertarian now, but back then they called him ultra-conservative, right? Well, he was many things, but not that. And it just seems to be, it's the go-to, in my lifetime, it's been the go-to label for, the media, the mainstream, the establishment, when somebody is fighting a good fight.
Yeah, disagreeing with the policy, whatever it is, whatever it's. And a lot of this is dictated by what the left is saying. And so there you have to get into the depredations of leftist ideology. Like, what is wrong with these people? Like, we always knew it was kind of bad. Like, how did they tolerate Sovietism for so long and apologize for it? Maoism, you named the kind of horror. And the left has always been wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Well, it's not really our kind of socialism. It's better than the alternative. So now you have the left all in on lockdowns and mandates, fax passports, and everything else. So as a result, the people who are resentful of this are considered to be right-wing, QAnon, racist, whatever. And that's even true in Australia, where you have the construction workers, all of whom are members of labor unions and vote Labor. I mean, the Bogan class are the ones pushing through the police in Melbourne today. And even now, you've got the New York Times describing them as influenced by right-wing billionaires, QAnon.
Oh, it's just so boring, isn't it?
I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now, these are all labor union Bogan types, like the workers and peasants. Like, that's who they are. They don't like their freedoms being taken away, for God's sake. They're not on QAnon message boards.
Yeah, it was the same types that voted for Brexit, by the way. And I note that that supposedly, depending on what you read, the resistance to lockdowns is coming from mostly in the US, or disproportionately, I should say, blue collar folks, and also, interestingly, people with PhDs. Which is in that, so there's, it seemed, I've become increasingly, I think, Burkean over the last few years, and actually Brexit was a big part of this, in his celebration of the, oh, you've frozen there. Can you hear me, Jeffrey? Have I lost you? Hello, Jeffrey. Oh. Jeffrey,
we bumped into a little. Okay. Yeah.
Jeffrey, I'm sorry. The internet seemed to do something funky for about a minute there. So I'm just going to say what I was saying, and I'll try and get an edit done. I was saying Brexit made me somewhat more Burkean in the celebration of the wisdom of the unlettered men. And, you know, I'm not an unlettered man. I feel quite smart at times. But they carried us to the right answer to the Brexit question, in my opinion. And, you know, maybe with instinct, maybe with, oh, I've lost you again. Okay, can you hear me now, Jeffrey?
Yeah, we've fully come back.
Okay, right. I'm going to say that one more time. I was saying, sorry about this, just so I've got it on the recording. I've become more of a Burkean in my respect for the wisdom of unlettered men, and Brexit was a big part of this for me. It's as if sometimes the basic human intuitions of the unlettered can push a country, a population to do the right thing in the end, in ways that, as Orwell would point out, the educated have educated themselves out of an ability to do. And here we are. It's interesting that a lot of blue collar folks, plus interestingly PhDs in the United States, seem to be the big groups that are disproportionately against lockdowns and the rising tyranny. What are your thoughts on that?
That's right. No, you're getting into issues of class and that sort of thing. And so it's a fascinating question because one of the things that capitalism has done for us is lifted all boats in a way, you know, and so we've got, you know, like a third now of the public, and within the last, say, 5 or 10 years, in a position to work from home, you know, from their laptops, you know, so extremely privileged, you know, accomplishing tasks that only the 1% could do 30 years ago, and nobody could do 50 years ago. And right when we get into this turning point, you know, suddenly where you've got a third of people that don't have to work and they get all the groceries delivered, and suddenly it's like lockdowns. Well, you know, I've not, and you and I should both do this, but I've not reread Schumpeter in light of this. But, you know, my memory of his book, Capitalism, Social and Democracy from 1946, is that what he said was that capitalism would create a sliver of the population that would be so comfortable in its wealth that it would lose track intellectually and culturally, otherwise, of the reasons why that wealth exists, and just take it for granted, and be more concerned about preserving their positions in power and privileges than they were about the well-being of the whole. And this is why he thought that eventually socialism would win out over capitalism. That's my memory of the book. Again, I have not read it in light of lockdowns, but wow, right? So yeah. I don't think these lockdowns would not have happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, it's funny because like in 2006, you had George W. Bush toying with the idea of lockdowns. And if you can go back and read his lockdown plans for the avian bird flu, which never left birds, and fortunately for him, but his idea is that as many people could work at home should. But of course, in 86? I meant 2006. So there just weren't that many people in 2006 that were capable of doing that. That was 15 years ago. So let's say it was 5% of the population. Well, now it's 30% of the population, you know? And then you've got this other demographic factor here, that this is a virus that's a threat to baby boomers almost exclusively.
Yes,
you know?
Yes, that's interesting.
And they're the ruling class. So you've got this privileged, wealthy ruling class elite that suddenly sees itself its immortality threatened by a new textbook virus, and they want to shut down the world for it. You know, it's very interesting.
I want to kind of flip this discussion and come at it from the personal, we've done abstract, high level. I want to do me right here, right now, or you, or any individual. I am getting increasingly interested in the I guess the importance of personal decision making, personal integrity in I guess, you know, the way a culture evolves. And I've been rather exercised by, I guess, this question. I'll see if I can formulate it. I might believe that on the weight of evidence, I'll call it a vaccine, but just to be clear, it's not a vaccine, it's an inoculation. But the vaccine will be a health benefit. The short-term benefit, a lot of evidence for that. And I'll take the risk on the lack of studies of long-term effects. And I might decide that, yes, it would make sense for me as a gentleman in his 40s, it would be marginal to take this thing. If it's free, why not? The problem is, if I do that, it seems to me that I am accepting a situation where I take back as a privilege rights that have been taken away from other individuals in certain groups. And it seems to me that, therefore, there's a moral issue in the current circumstances, given what's being done with and around the vaccine, of taking it unless I really need it to save my life, which of course I don't, because I'm not, in my 70s or 80s with comorbidities. I am actually having, I think the question of whether to take this vaccine, therefore, the individual decision of whether to do that, I think it involves personal integrity at this point. I think it involves moral considerations. I think, ironically, it involves consideration of everyone around, but not, I need to take it to save their lives, because it won't do that, but to save their free society. I need to not take it if I'm thinking of other people. It certainly seems to me that if I were to take the vaccine so that I could go to bars in Seattle after October the 25th, it would certainly be wrong to do so, because I would have to show my papers and about having had the vaccine to go in. And I cannot participate in that. That is immoral, and I should not do it. The fact that I should not comply, does that mean I shouldn't take the vaccine? Is that a good enough reason to not take it? If more of us started thinking in those terms, would this situation be very different? Or am I just being ridiculously precious in that line of argument?
No, I think what you're tapping into is something a little even more foundational than the availability of the vaccine, or are you, because you could argue that, look, you could take the vaccine, it's not going to take it away from somebody else. It's just not going to cause, just any more than when you were young and your mother said you should eat your dinner because people are starving in Ethiopia. I remember thinking, well, I mean, my eating this carrot is not going to cause a kid in Ethiopia to suddenly get food. So I knew that was false. So that it might be false your sense that refusing the vaccine somehow gives it to somebody else. It might not. But I think what you're trying to tap into is a very interesting moral intuition that you're trying to either concoct or revive.
Yes, go on.
Which has something to do with the belief that we've approached this pandemic completely incorrectly. And what does that mean? It has something to do with the sharing of the burdens of the downsides of our existence more democratically than we have. So, and this, I think, is a critical issue. It's like, what does a civilized society do in the presence of pathogens and infectious diseases? To whom do we assign the burden of herd immunity? Who has to get it, and who can stay safe from it? Who is privileged?
And to add to that, Jeff, if I may, which harms do we inflict on others or on some section of the population to that end?
That's right. And who is deserving of the harms, and who's meritorious of avoiding them? And that was immediately how people began to think. Like at the very start of this pandemic, who are the essential workers? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, oh, the people who are going to deliver the groceries, the people who are going to, make sure the groceries show up in the stores, people are going to be at the hospitals, like, and who's unessential, which is a funny word. Like we actually flip these terms in a funny way. The unessential people were really the privileged people who could live off income stream by staying home. The essential people are the people we forced out as sandbags to confront the virus, to get infected, acquire the natural immunities so that we could stay safe. This is a medieval system. It's always been the system. It was for dealing with disease in pre-modern societies. They always assigned the burden of the pathogen to the other, to the people who were following the non-majority religions, to the non-native speakers, to the lower classes, to the non-ruling class, racial ethnic groups, and so on and so on. They did this in the Old South under the slaveocracy. The slaves had to bear all the burden of all the new pathogens. The people, the gentlefolk, in the manor estates would scurry around to avoid the yellow fever always. And whole societies have been constructed around this idea of who gets to stay clean and who has to be dirty. And what I don't think that we've thought about enough is whether that is a correct way to view the social order in the presence of infectious diseases. And if it's not, what is the correct way to think about how we're going to organize our society in the presence of pathogens? Can we still have human rights? Can we still have freedoms? Can we still have democracy? And if so, what does that look like, and what does that imply for us in our own behaviors and our actions? So my own belief on this is that stay home, stay safe is an evil and immoral idea.
Yes. I think I'm with you on that.
Yeah, it's just wrong. And I'm sorry, an unmentioned libertarian organization started pushing that message out in March and April. And I don't want to single out the libertarians just because I'm particularly bitter about their failure to step up here. But almost every ruling class outfit, from the theater downtown around its placards, stay home, stay safe, to the media types, to the New York Times, who would run instructions every day for its readership. Stay home, stay safe, and have your groceries delivered. Oh, really? By whom?
It's so dirty.
By whom? By people who don't read the New York Times.
Clearly, yeah, I know.
Clearly, right? So I think the whole philosophy of stay home, stay safe, or for that matter, get your vaccine, you're only allowed into the restaurant if you're vaccinated. All this is ruling class philosophy, and it's undemocratic, unequal, inegalitarian, uncivilized, and flies in the face of an implicit and endogenous evolved social contract that we've had over the last 300 or 400 years to deal with infectious disease in a way that's consistent with human rights, freedom, and the equal dignity of everybody. So the question is so how do we deal with this? And this is the point of what my friends Sinatra Gupta, Martin Kulldorff, and Jay Bhattacharya call focus protection. So focus protection sounds like, okay, it sounds maybe like a little clinical, but what they really mean is only the vulnerable populations are the ones who are entitled to stay safe. Now, so how do you mostly define that? You mostly define that by age. Mm-hmm. Who gets old? Everyone. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter what language you speak, doesn't matter your class, doesn't matter your religion. Everyone, every human being gets old. So the idea that a society is going to organize itself in the presence of a new pathogen around the protection of the elderly from the disease is an egalitarian and democratic and civilized ways to think, because it doesn't discriminate on arbitrary class-based, religion-based, racial-based grounds. And that is the theory that's consistent with modernity, with freedom. It's just extremely important. If you get this wrong, you end up creating a new caste system, recreating a kind of medieval segregated society. And that's exactly what we're doing. Because we got it wrong, we are going back to a pre-modern social system.
And just to be clear, whereas we should be doing that, drawing that line, that those vulnerable versus those not vulnerable, what we're actually doing is drawing a line between those who comply and put the injection in and those who do not. And because that's a choice, we're entitled to take your rights away, right? That's what we're actually doing. Is that right?
Yeah, and this follows along class and income lines too, and race lines. Apparently, clearly it does.
So it seems to me that as an individual, I can make two reasonable arguments that put me in at different places with taking a vaccine that are, if you like, sufficiently moral arguments. I could say that's all right. Everything you've just said is true, Jeffrey. But obviously, I shouldn't let these evil people who are pushing this change the decision I would have made anyway. In the absence of all of that tyranny, I would take the vaccine, so I still should. Or I could say, no, their evil tyranny changes the moral part of the decision as to whether I should take a vaccine. Although I might otherwise, the fact is I cannot now in this situation do so without complying with, contributing to this tyrannical remaking of our culture and our society. And therefore, unless I need it to save my life, I should not have that vaccine. What do you think about that A and that B?
I think you're right. And I would say that you could even go further and say yes, your decision is consistent with liberty and human rights, and that's true. But actually, even more substantially and robustly, it's consistent with the democratic outlook, an egalitarian understanding of the society. You don't want a caste system. You don't want to participate in the creation of a new segregation. That's
exactly right.
And which is to say that your decision is focused on public health, on public benefit.
Absolutely, it is. And but for me, it feels like an issue. It actually feels like an issue of integrity. It feels like an issue of moral consistency on my part. Let me then take the next step, which would be, okay, well, that's great. But if I were to get COVID and I were to die, and that's increasingly, that happened in some way because I didn't take the vaccine, then, well, I've chosen which hill to die on, literally, and nobody would know. It would make no difference to anyone. The fact that I am not having the vaccine, not going to a bar in Seattle for as long as this ridiculous thing is in place, that doesn't actually change anything. So what good did I do?
I don't know, what good does your podcast do? I mean, what good do we do at all as intellectuals? I think we have to act and behave according to principle, which is what's happened over the course of this pandemic. People have just forgotten their principles. I mean, like every principle by which we lived in the past, it's just been thrown out the window, and we embrace raw, ugly self-interest at the expense of public health, at the expense of the well-being of the whole. I mean, we've just brutalized each other through segregation and otherization of everything. I mean, we've gone back to these weird primitive. So let me just reflect on that. So somebody needs to write a book about this. Actually, this is a good book, by the way.
I'm glad you showed it to us. You can tell us more about that in a moment.
It's amazing. But one of the funny things I noticed early on in this pandemic is this, and you only find these things out by talking to people privately, not by reading newspapers, but by just talking to people. But there's an impulse to always believe that the virus is not where you are, it's always somewhere else. It's like, well, I'm in a COVID-free bubble, me and my people. Certain income, certain religion, certain race. We're clean, but I don't know about those dirty people. I've never heard so much class talk in my life as I have over the course of the last 20 months. And I could tell you stories. I mean, just like everybody thinks wherever they are is the clean place and the other people are the dirty people. I mean, and I've been all over the country, and that's true everywhere, right? So the people in Austin think the people in Dallas are dirty. I mean, it's just true. I mean, you know, the people in the Berkshires think, well, it's weird because it gets ever more sectorized, right? So certainly Massachusetts thought New York was dirty. But within Massachusetts, the Berkshires definitely thought that Boston was dirty. But within the Berkshires, Great Barrington thought that Pittsfield was dirty. Yeah. But within Great Barrington, you know, 10th Street thought 12th Street was dirty. So, you know, it's just, right? It's just crazy. It's like, wow, this vaccine is everywhere except where you are.
I just want to relate this back to that point we made earlier about Hitler. That's how you take over society, is you basically atomize it, right? So that the links of civil society, which are horizontal links among people and groups of people, right, no longer exist. So the only links that then can exist are from the individual to the state. That's how you do it, right? You basically destroy society to take it over. That's what we're witnessing.
Well, that's right. And that's what plexiglass is for, right? So suddenly you go into the story like, oh, and by the way, merchant craft is the way we've gotten to know each other. It's like, oh, here's my waiter. Oh, here's my merchant who's selling me a product at CVS. You know, this is the way we encounter each other through commerce. This is the way human society is formed day by day. It's a major context by which we start to overcome the lack of trust. You speak about trust. This is how we learn to trust each other, through commercial interactions. Suddenly one day, I couldn't speak to the person, you know, because there's a big piece of plastic. Suddenly he's pathogenic, or I am. I don't know. We don't know. So let's just put a big plastic. And now, Christ almighty, it's true all over the country. There are servers wear masks while we sit and luxuriate. You know, it just makes me crazy. And we do an homage to the working class by putting on the mask when we walk in the restaurant, but once we sit down, we can take our mask.
mean, it's the emperor has no clothes, isn't it? It's the emperor has a mask. The emperor has no clothes. I mean, why aren't we? The thing that I think maybe scares me the most is that not even that we're doing it, it's that we're not laughing at the absurdity of it.
We don't know it. Marvin, people are so unaware. I'll just give you an example. So one of the reasons I ate a sandwich today, I ate it with my hands. So the reason we eat sandwiches with our hands is because we have a long-running tradition in the West that people of all classes can put bread in their hands and eat it that way, rather than with a knife and a fork. Now, this is basically a decision made in the court of Louis XIV. And the question was why? Because, you know, they had new innovations, they had forks, and they were innovating, you know, manners and that sort of thing. So the question is, what do you do with bread? So it was an overt decision by the court that no matter how noble your birth, how high ranking you were, you would always eat bread with your hands as an homage to the working classes. So that's why we eat bread with our hands instead of knife and fork. Of course, you'd never do that with a sausage unless you're a pig, but you can do it with bread. So it's the same thing with masks. So now the upper class wear masks as an homage to the working class that they assign to be the sandbags for the disease, just as a way of like a little tip of the hat, you know? But we take them off as soon as we can. So as soon as we sit down at dinner.
Yeah.
Off it comes. Or we've seen the mayor of San Francisco the other day partying it up at a party. She takes off her mask. She says, well, I was having fun. Of course I don't have to wear my mask. No, we only wear the masks as an homage, you know, to the burdens we've imposed on other people as a recognition. So yeah, these cultural tropes go way back. And it has nothing to do with public health. Of course, this is entirely cultural and segregationist.
I was on a plane about a year and a quarter ago. I was actually on 3 planes. I was going from Seattle to London, but because of COVID, it was actually Seattle, Reykjavik, Copenhagen, London. which of course I'm sure increased my exposure to any pathogens relative to if I just taken a direct flight. But anyway, it was either Reykjavik or Copenhagen. I think it was Reykjavik, where we land and we've all been sitting next to each other masked up on this plane. And then the announcement comes, and she's reading off the federally required blurb, right? That because of COVID, we are going to exit the plane in a COVID safe manner, right? Now we've been sitting next to each other,
breathing on each other
from Seattle to Reykjavik. And so we all go through this painfully slow disembarkation where rows have to get up and wait till the row in front is 6 foot away and and then what happens? We go down the stairs onto the tarmac to be all put in buses, all packed in like sardines to go to the terminal. And I was like, but the thing that scared me, Jeffrey, is I'm the only person laughing. That's what scares me.
I know.
Hold on. This requires the government to come up with it, a huge multinational company to institute it as policy, all the employees to go along with it. And as it happens, all of these passengers just to think makes complete sense because they weren't talking about it or laughing out loud or complaining about it. Now, well, if everybody just can turn on a dime to go along with that kind of absurdity, then if there's no logic, there's no rationality, there's no humanity, and there was none exhibited in that. I mean, it was like something out of I don't know what it was like. It was a cross between a Monty Python skit and a Kafka novel. Then all bets are off, Jeffrey. All bets are off. Why have any hope? I don't know.
Well, let's step back a quick step here to observe something else about these class distinctions and the impulse to compliance. The ruling classes are far more compliant, right? With all the kabuki dance, whereas the working classes don't give a. And I learned this very early on in the pandemic to only shop at the working class grocery stores. So at the thrift stores, I never had mask mandates, at the low price, at the Aldi's, the low price grocery stores, nobody gives a fly. But you go to the fancy,
God, that's right.
The grocery stores with the philosophy, there's gonna be a Karen on every grocery store aisle. And the same thing happened on airlines. I realized this, and I'm afraid to even mention names, but let's just say that there's an airline that's kind of expensive and kind of fancy. All right, they're going to be pull that mask over your nose. But if you fly on an airline that's famously said less expensive and doesn't allow a lot of luggage, and you're sitting on like a bench, I don't care. I mean, and I've learned to fly on the because I have to take a lot of flights even now. So I've learned to always take the cheapest one, the low class airlines, because they're far less stringent and strict about all these mandates. So it's a fascinating thing.
It is a
fascinating thing. Just the class distinctions and compliance. And I don't know what that says entirely. Maybe it goes back to your Burkean point. I'm not entirely sure I know, but wow. Oh, and here's another interesting thing. I'm sure you've seen this, but we've seen the very low level of vaccine compliance among African Americans in this country, and minority communities in general. Asians and Hispanics. It's definitely a class difference, right? And so the mandates came along. So the other day, the head of Black Lives Matter in New York decided to come out and rage against the mandates and organized a protest of all Black folks against these mandates. So how sympathetic was the media to BLM this time? Not at all. Suddenly she was just non-compliant and she's a problem and, following fake science, probably a QAnon person, and so on. So she was denounced by every blue check mark on Twitter. So how is it possible that in 1 year's time you have BLM go from the heroic, glorious, indefatigably moral, pure source of all truth to becoming non-compliant, problem for public health? it's just a reminder to me of the long history this country has in using race to achieve ruling class objectives, right? So we're told a story about race all the time, and the story is always changing. But it only changes when the ruling class has a different political agenda. So Black people are being sold out right now in this country over these vaccine mandates. They're just being sold down the river. They don't care. They don't matter. Nobody cares. Whereas only last year, everybody's supposed to acquiesce entirely to BLM priorities. So it's a fascinating thing. We suddenly realize the extent to which we're being manipulated.
Do we realize? I mean, people, as I said, the people getting off that plane, the stewardesses in the plane, the CEO of the airline, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that they realize they're contributing.
Know. Well, we all want to know the answer to that question. To what extent? I mean, where are we as a social order right now? Where is public opinion on this? Where is the dynamic? How does the resistance exist? How strong is it? How brave is it? How far is it willing to go? What are going to be the election outcomes? And we don't know the answer. So I was devastated by the results in the California governor's recall election, right? I'm sure you were too. I was depressed for hours when I got that,
Hasn't California just kind of dropped off the left side of America? Yeah, I thought I didn't know it was still part of it. Okay, but if you say so.
Well, somebody said, well, all the people who wanted to do some recall have left the state.
A lot of them have. I mean, there's a reason why Idaho and Utah have the hottest housing markets in the country the last year.
Yeah, no, that's right. So we're going to see this country has faced the biggest demographic upheaval since the 1830s, right? And just in terms of people moving from moving away from despotism towards freedom. That's why people moved west. That's why people moved south in the 1830s and 1840s. It was just to get away from that which they didn't consider to be prosperous and free. So we're seeing that again. And what's the political outcome of that? I don't know, but I can't wait to find out. I don't know.
Is it though a two steps back, one step forward process? Or do you think that it could be a 2 steps back, 3 steps forward process as people, react to the decrease of freedom that they experience in their lives?
Well, I think we began this whole podcast by talking about the great question of optimism versus pessimism.
Yes.
And the fact is that I cannot help but be an optimist. I just am at my root. And I have to believe that the outcome of this catastrophe will ultimately be a renewed appreciation for liberty and a public work on the part of many people who want to get it back. I mean, Hayek says this, right? In his essay on socialism at the very end, this is 1946, 47, says, let's hope that people don't have to lose their liberties entirely to finally realize the essential moral obligation to fight for them always, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think if that idea of losing our liberties entirely has any meaning at all, we've come very close to experiencing that in the last 20 months,
Oh, yes.
And if this isn't going to wake people up, I don't know what will.
The thing is, though, that given the mass compliance with the whole vaccine, the lockdowns and all of that, the majority of the population are in receipt of the privileges that go with the taking away of rights of everyone else. So I don't know that the everyone else has the numbers.
I don't know either. I can't get a fix on it. I'm pretty sure that we've got like a third with us. I'm not sure why I say that, but I feel like we've got about a third of the people more or less will listen to this conversation and go, yeah, these guys have it going. How do we get that to half? How do we get it to more than half?
Well, now that whether a third is enough, Jeffrey, it's not whether it's a third or a half. It's whether the other 2/3 only contain a small minority that are going to stand as hard in opposition to us, or
That's right.
whether it's a complete third on the other side, or more. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. So early on in the lockdowns, I realized pretty early on that it was just really not that many people doing this. It was, fewer than 300 people in this country, maybe the world, who were actually imposing these lockdowns, and they encouraged me. But you're right, the willingness of so many to acquiesce to the expertise, to the for fear of the police. But look, it's complicated, right? It's always more complicated than it seems. I'll just tell you a quick story. I was in a liquor store 2 weeks ago. This is a petty story, and the owner, I walked in without a mask, of course. And the owner was like, great to see you, fine. Bought my gin and left. I went back again, and there was a lady there, and she said, I'm sorry, you have to put on the mask. And I said, I was just here. The owner said I didn't. I mean, he didn't care. She goes, really? He didn't care? I said, no. She goes, son of a bitch. Well, great. No, you don't have to wear a mask. It's fine. I think I'll take off mine too. And so we both wore maskless and have enjoying ourselves. So then I went back to the same store. I'm skipping a couple of stops. I went back to the store and I walked in. And the owner said to me again, he goes, you know what I really like about you? I said, what? Because you don't wear a mask. I said, well, thank you very much. Then in walks another customer, and he says to me, so the customer leaves, and he goes, listen, just for the future, I don't care if you wear a mask, but when another customer walks in, please put on your mask, because he could easily report me to the government, then I could get fined.
There it is. I think there's more truth in that story than in everything we've discussed for the last hour. I mean, so that is it, isn't it?
Situation, yeah.
And so the question is, the question now could be restated as, let me say that, will the future of our country, of our culture, be determined by the fact that that shopkeeper doesn't care if you wear a mask, or by the fact that he will participate in the compliance system when he's under threat? And indeed, I guess that is the question of the history of liberty, isn't it?
It is. But you've read the great book, the Black History of Communism, or the Black Book of Communism, right? So there's this whole chapter on China. And I remember I first read it, and I realized something really striking about the Cultural Revolution, that it wasn't, it didn't happen where countless millions died, right? It wasn't like imposed by Beijing, by Mao in particular. He was like a philosopher king, whatever, just had this view that people should live in the rural areas and they shouldn't own property, whatever, but it didn't really do that much in terms of, it was the Red Guard, right? So it's the masses that were recruited to be brutal that actually accomplished the mass killings under the Cultural Revolution. I remember reading that at the time thinking, these Chinese are some weird people. I can't believe that they would do that, At least we in the West understand the difference between the rulers and the ruled, between the dictator and the people. The people love liberty here. That would never happen to us. Ha! Wow. So it turns out that chapter in the Black Book of Communism, as it relates to the Cultural Revolution, was a good description, at a much larger, more bloody scale, on exactly the sociology of compliance in this country since lockdowns. The sheer numbers of people who are willing to be enforcers for the state without pay, pretty shocking.
So, yes, now that's interesting, because it enables me to reframe the moral qualm that I threw at you earlier about the vaccine as, what do you do when you would make a certain decision in a situation, though, in which if you were to make it, you would be becoming a tool of compliance, right? Like that's another way of just saying what's being weighed up, isn't it? There's a reason to do something, but I'm operating in a system where to do it, I become a tool, I become a cog, not a willful, maybe not even an intentional, but a knowing cog in an evil system.
So the only thing I would say to that is I have many friends who didn't want it and finally got it. And I can tell you this, Robin, after they got the jab, they're angrier than ever before. They didn't suddenly become, oh, now I've got the jab. Now I feel like I'm a good citizen. No, they got furious. In fact, I think that's a major part of the fury in this country right now, is the number of people that had a needle stuck in them, stuck with a potion they don't understand, they need.
Because they've just experienced giving up something precious, their own integrity, to the evil, right? And they've lost something they know they can never get back. A part of them has died. Is that what it is?
Yeah, and that's happened to millions of people all over the world. So what does that do to you when you suddenly just feel like a supplicant? You know,
it makes you less of a person.
You feel like you've given up your dignity. You know.
Do you know I was teaching in Oxford this summer, a wonderful experience, and Balliol College, Oxford, where we were for a couple of weeks, have mandates, terrified compliance. You can imagine an institution like that. So we all had to do the thing you were just talking about of putting the masks on as we walked into the Great Hall in the cafeteria to get our food before taking them off to eat it, eat the food. And a lot of people there are a good few people there were sympathetic with our view on this. And there was in England, I think there still is, there's like an exemption. Yeah, you can get certain exemptions. And a rule attached to that is that that no one can demand of you the reason for your exemption. It's kind of a nod to, health privacy or whatever, right? So I was offered by somebody who did this, a PDF that would enable me to print the official exemption card that says, I have an exemption, in the knowledge that nobody could actually ask me why I got it, or if it were in fact the case, or to prove that it were the case. And then if I just put this badge on, and quite a few people in the college had this, that they would be able to go through and not participate in the nonsense of the masks. And so somebody said, look, do you want the PDF? And a part of me wanted it because I feel that all of these actions are under duress. But I said, no, I don't want it, because I am certainly going to not allow these people to make a liar out of me. I'm not going to sacrifice my integrity for this. That came to my mind as you told me this story. Because if I had done that, then I try very, very, very hard not to lie. It would be a lie. And if I let that, like, who am I if I lose that part of me? Sure. But that is exactly how this works, right? I mean, it works by getting us to morally compromise. Again, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, it's, those Germans, some part of them knew that in not treating their Jewish friend on their street the same way, they were doing something wrong. Some part of them knew. They made a compromise. And those little compromises, they add up, and then the people aren't those people anymore. And indeed, they get to be SS guards at the concentration camps. It's the same people. It's the same population. We all, Jordan Peterson makes much of this. We can all be an SS guard. I could become one too, unless I don't even begin to walk down that road. And sometimes that's an easy refusal, as it has been for most of my life. Now, today, it's a slightly harder one.
It's slightly harder, and it's much harder if, for example, you're employed as a cop, enforcing COVID regulations. I saw an interview the other day with an Australian policeman. And Australia is a very civilized country with peaceful people. Everybody's friendly. The police have always been very nice to me. They're super nice. Good, kind of Robin Koerner ideal of public sector, when it seems very integrated with the population. They don't seem that different. Everybody, government more or less works, like you always imagined it might and could. And I'd never have believed, because I'm an American. You are too, actually. But Australia, suddenly this good government became a very bad government. And I saw an interview with the policeman, and the guy said, look, I hate these lockdowns. I think this COVID stuff's ridiculous, but I'm not trained to do anything else. This is the only job I have. and I've got a pension, so I'm going to do my job. And he just flat out said that to a protester. He said, I'm going to make you comply because that's, he said, and the guy said, well, don't, I mean, just get another job. And he said, but I don't have any of the training. This is what I do.
What would you say to that cop, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I've been in that position before. I said, you're wasting your life. You're wasting your life. You're doing bad things with your life, and you only have one life, one time to go around, and you're doing bad things with it. You're better off financially suffering, being alienated, being unemployed, than losing your soul.
If you were that cop, would you make that decision if it meant taking government welfare?
Yeah, at some point people do whatever is necessary to survive, and taking government welfare, I think, is a far less egregious thing to do than beating people and kicking people and tasing people for non-compliance with vaccine mandates. You know, I can't, at some point you have to say no. You do. And we might be coming to this point. I mean, it's very interesting to watch what's happening in Australia. The crackdowns and the spraying of bullets and whatever, the tear gas guns and everything. The protesters are increasing in numbers by the day. It reminds me of a scene from like Prague in 1988, or Russia in '89, or Romania.
Romania,
it's
I remember that Christmas. Yeah,
it's starting to feel that way. I mean, are we there yet? I don't know, but I tell you what, Robin, I never wanted to live in a world in which the West would be facing these kinds of, would we be asking these questions about the West?
I know. I mean, here we are. Which part of the world will be the bulwark to what China is doing? Well, that part of the world that could have been is hollowed itself out morally and philosophically, and we're in it. And it's just,
we were so congratulatory of ourselves. You remember after '89, we were like, wow, the slave parts of the world, the Iron Curtains fell, the wall is down, the bad regimes have collapsed, we've won. I remember feeling at the time like, I don't know, I'm not so sure about this. Like, what's next? What's what are the conditions under which democracies die? Well,
yes. No, exactly. Yeah, and it's that old saw about never being more than a generation away from it, isn't it? Yeah. I would love to carry this on, Jeffrey, but we have spoken for comfortably over an hour.
Yeah, an hour and a half. Yeah, we've done very well. Let's meet up again. I'll tell you more about the Brownstone Institute and what I'm up to. I've got a little link I want to send you privately to tell you about our inaugural dinner. So I hope you can attend.
Let's definitely do that. And let's do that sooner rather than later, because I haven't given you an opportunity to talk about the book or the Brownstone. And of course, it was actually seeing that content come out of Brownstone that caused me to text you after all this time and for us to actually do this. So I definitely want to do that. So how about just in a week or two?
Let's do it. No, that sounds good. Let's meet up. I've missed you, Robin.
Yeah, have a wonderful weekend and thank you very much for all you do. Take care, Jeffrey. Bye.